All right, we're back. Hope you guys are up, ready, and excited. The next presentation we have is on historic LGBTQ places in Indianapolis. It will be presented by Jordan Ryan and Meg Purnsley. Give a round of applause.
Thanks, everyone. So happy to join you all today at Indie Design Week. So my name is Jordan Ryan, and I'll be kicking off this talk about local LGBTQ spaces. Just to start, I'm going to let you know that I will use LGBTQ and queer interchangeably. So a little bit of background information on our project. Back in May of 2014, the National Park Service launched its LGBTQ Heritage Initiative, and that was to identify and interpret sites and stories, as well as nominate related properties to the National Register of Historic Places. And this came about because at the time, there were only 2 queer-related properties on the National Register, and that was New York City's Stonewall Inn and Chicago's Henry Gerber House. That were listed as historic landmarks, as well as 4 additional properties in Fire Island, New York, and Stonington, Connecticut. So since this initiative kicked off now 7 years ago, we do have an additional 6 sites that have been added, with many more pending approval and in the pipeline. And I just want to really emphasize how small these numbers are. We're talking about 95,000 National Register listings. And of this, 12 to 15 are barely skimming the surface of queer history. So that's sort of the background context of where we were starting nationally. And here's a little bit about what was going on locally as well. So at the same time, Indiana Landmarks kicked off their own historic site survey. And this was also related to the outcry of House Joint Resolution 3. Some of you may remember it was a proposed constitutional amendment to ban same-sex marriage in the state. And at the same time, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which you might remember as RFRA, a law that would grant religious liberty rights to individuals and corporations with little anti-discrimination protections to the queer community, was also being discussed. So there's really this local outcry and a need to identify, protect, and celebrate historic queer spaces. There's also a preservation awareness sort of talked about within the historic preservation community, which is, a lot of queer sites are located in neighborhood historic districts. So they're protected, they're listed as contributing architecture, but they don't actually explicitly acknowledge their LGBTQ history. So all of this is going on, and Landmarks starts a survey to locate and identify potential historic queer sites using resources from numerous local archives and libraries to build a survey to think about the national context and what's going on around the country, map data, and determine what is eligible to be protected, and talk about what we've lost. So a little bit about the survey itself. I was brought in as a surveyor in 2014 with Indiana Landmarks. And one of the first things I was looking at is reviewing sort of the literature of where we were in terms of historic preservation, queer sort of spatial theory, looking at our local and national historic district statuses, things like that. And so a few common themes really struck out to me, and this is just real quick kind of bullet points, but there is no single LGBTQ experience or community, just like any other minority community. We have to acknowledge sort of this intersectional, nuanced spectrum of experiences. There's always going to be tensions that exist between both the heterosexual and sort of capitalism's control of space and the surveillance of space, and how different minority communities claim, appropriate, subvert these spaces, right? And then speaking about intersectionality, obviously there's going to be class, cultural, and racial divisions that factor heavily into these queer spaces. And even sort of building on that, considering gender privilege and how that can lead gays and lesbians to desire different kinds of spaces and to interact with spaces differently. And then thinking critically about historic preservation, I would argue that as a field, it is behind on understanding and honoring cultural diversity. So keeping all this in mind, let's dive into the data where we are right now. So here's my map showing you 419 locations in Marion County that we've surveyed. So please consider that this shows you what has been surveyed based on the archival materials that were available a few years back. So, there's always new collections being made accessible. There's a pretty good chance that we can find more sites based on new documentation that's been made available. So we have 419 locations, 28% of which are already protected on our local or National Historic Register, although these sites are generally not acknowledged for their LGBTQ history. 14% of the sites are eligible to be protected, and another 14% have already been demolished. So let's dive a little bit into the data, which we decided to organize thematically. So the first theme we have here is civil rights, which is defined as locations in which protests, events, and meetings for the purpose of extending civil rights to the LGBTQ community occurred. And out of this, we have 51 locations. You're going to notice with a lot of these sites, this very strong sort of north to south axis, as well as a downtown, and then typically sort of that stretch, that band on the north side going from west to east. You'll see that trend in a lot of these maps. One example of civil rights that I think is worth saving, some people would disagree, is the City County building, which some of you know, downtown. It was the site of over 400 same-sex marriage licenses during that 2.5 days before the state ban. And I think that's a really important reason to, protect this building. The next theme is the arts. We had 30 locations surveyed. So these are places, they're cultural institutions like theaters, cinemas, art galleries, performance halls, just places that supported LGBTQ artistic efforts. And these actually tended to be the most protected, with 53% of these sites were already listed on the National Register. So one of which that isn't, that I think is worth considering, is the Emerson Theater, which some of you may remember if you were ever into metal or hardcore music in the 2000s, you probably went to this theater, but it is known in the 1980s for showing different LGBTQ interest films. I just think the facade is really beautiful as well. The next theme is health, with 44 locations. These were health organizations and clinics and doctors' offices and events devoted to the medical needs of the community. So you'll notice a pretty big cluster in the downtown area. One of these sites is the Damien Center off Arsenal Avenue. This is the largest HIV/AIDS service organization in Indiana. The next theme is businesses. These were, retail spaces, bookstores, niche interests, salons, all sorts of businesses either owned by queer business people or predominantly serving that community. So here's one example on the north side in Broad Ripple. This is at 54th and College, just a really exquisite one-story commercial building that at one point had a cyber cafe that was very important to the local queer community. The next theme is leisure, 88 locations here. So these were alcohol serving establishments, things like bars, dance halls, places with drag shows, mainly serving the queer community. And these were also pretty high. We had 36% already listed of the 88 locations. And one of my favorites that has no protections is the Ritz Theater, also at one point known as the Famous Door. Probably the earliest contemporary form of drag, but not the earliest. If there's a lot of definitions of drag. So just keep in mind in the 1970s, this was one drag performance hall and a really wonderful theater that needs a lot of love. The next theme was residences. So these are just mapping dwellings, both owned and rented, that LGBTQ community members resided in. And this was also a pretty high category for protections. Out of the 26 locations, 58% were already listed. One that is not, that I would argue should be, is Riley Towers, which is a very popular residence for the community. And it was also an early site of early Pride Fests and a place of a lot of political organizing in the 1980s. And the last theme is events, quite a few with 118 locations. So this included annual LGBTQ events and celebrations, as well as, performances, speeches, things like that. And then I also did keep track of assaults and homicides that were associated with members of the queer community being victims. And these are mostly happening outside of bars. And then that's the circle, just because so many of the events happened at the circle. So at the end, we ultimately found 60 properties that were eligible to be protected. In some way, we triaged a 3-tiered system for ranking and prioritizing buildings. If I was the benevolent dictator of the world, these are some of the sites I would recommend for protection on the right. And then it's important to remember that a lot of buildings were considered non-contributing because they would have been too young at the time. Some of these original, historic listings were happening because of the 50-year rule, but now they're definitely eligible. And speaking a little bit about the demolitions, we had about 11% overall have already been demolished. That's pretty alarming. We have a lot of closures in recent years. Many bars have shut their doors, Talbot Street, the Varsity, 501 Eagle, the 10. So one day I was surveying this beautiful sort of Art Deco, Art Nouveau Bellflower Clinic, and the next day it was demolished for the Eskenazi hospital reconfiguration. The first time I presented this data, while I was presenting the Unicorn Club, the male strip club was demolished. So I just want to really emphasize that the clock is ticking on saving these buildings. Another issue we consider is integrity. There's not really good standard guidelines for these sort of queer structures and integrity questions. So the main question I have is, if a gay bar shutters their front windows to protect community members for decades or even 50 years, does that become part of the building's historic integrity? And I ask that question because we do have structures like the 10 on top that's showing when the 10 was the 10, it closes, they rehab the building, and now it's sort of reconfigured back to its original-ish historic look. So, sort of how do we grapple with preservation over time and in different layers of integrity? So last but not least, what do we do next? There's a lot we can do. We can amend nominations to really explicitly talk about all of this LGBTQ history. We can write new nominations to protect buildings that have no protections, collaborate with other groups who are developing queer scholarship, programs, exhibits, fundraise for future nominations for renovation grants, and certainly promote the interpretation and programs, walking tours, building tours, things like that. So speaking of collaborating and promoting, one exciting outcome of the survey is that the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission is incorporating this research into their Preserve Indy initiative. So thank you for your time, and I'm going to pass it over to Meg, our IHPC admin, to tell you more about that project.
Thanks so much, Jordan. You're a tough act to follow, so I'm not going to repeat too many of the things that you have already covered so eloquently, but I wanted to give a little bit of background for everyone about the Indianapolis Historic Preservation Commission, because I never assume that people know who we are. We are a division of the Department of Metropolitan Development, and we exist in the building that Jordan mentioned in her presentation, with the City County building. And we are a little unique in that even though we function as a division of the Department of Metropolitan Development, we actually operate under a state law instead of a local ordinance. And so on the next slide, I'm going to give you a little bit of background about the Historic Preservation Commission itself and and how they exist and function. So the IHPC, as we are known as, is a 9-member commission, and we've been around for a little bit, since 1967. And the commission is a group of dedicated volunteers. They are not paid, and they are appointed by the mayor and the city county council, and they serve for a 4-year term. The mission of the commission is to protect historically significant buildings and sites throughout Marion County. And the staff of the commission is a small but mighty team of 6, and we are here on the 18th floor of the city county building. And so next, what we do on a daily basis is protect those historic areas that I mentioned. And since 1967, we have designated 17 historic areas throughout Marion County. There are approximately 6,000 buildings under the IHPC's jurisdiction, and there are 14 individual sites. So the commission has the ability to legally protect both historic areas and individual buildings. A few that you may have heard of are Lockerbie Square, Heron Warren Place. You've probably heard of the Old North Side, and of course, Massachusetts Avenue is another one. So, as Jordan had previously mentioned, on our next slide, I wanted to cover a little bit about the program that we started that ultimately led to this partnership that Jordan referenced. So we decided that it was time to update the historic area plans for all of those 17 historic areas that I mentioned. Each historic district has a set of design guidelines and a plan that includes the history of each of the properties that are within the boundaries of that district. And as Jordan alluded to, the history that is covered in those plans, it's brief, but it does not include any history about people or the culture of the LGBTQ community. And in some of our historic areas, that is a very significant part of the story. And so it just happened to be really good timing, actually, when we started to have this conversation. I think the conversation went a little something like, hey, Jordan, whatever happened to that survey and what are we doing with it? And so we started a brainstorm about what can the IHPC do in partnership with Indiana Landmarks and the State Historic Preservation Office and a whole bunch of other people. We said, what tools do we have in our toolbox that we can use to really give some teeth to the protection of the history of the LGBTQ sites that are in our districts? And that's when we said, hey, wait a minute. A lot of these historic sites are already protected because they're in IHPC districts, but nobody knows that because the plans don't talk about it. And so from that there was a committee that was created from that idea. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Vice President Zach Adamson from the City County Council, who was a huge supporter of this initiative and ultimately was the one who helped us really cast a light on the importance of this project. The City County Council ultimately, they approved a proclamation that effectively said, this history is important and we need to do our part to make sure that the city of Indianapolis is really focused on doing something to make sure that we are protecting it and that we are honoring it. And the IHPC followed suit and adopted a resolution that same year. And that resolution says that we are committed to following through with the survey and getting that information in the historic area plans as part of our Preserve India initiative. And so from that, we were able to, as you can see from this slide, get a little bit of press coverage on this project. It kind of synced up with Pride Month as well. And so we did a little advertising of the project at Indy Pride. And also we just made sure that everybody was just aware that we were going to be doing this. And I think it was very well received in that regard. On the next slide, you can see the official legally binding document, which is the resolution from the IHPC. And I mention this because I think it goes without saying that there are very few legal tools that provide any type of protection or acknowledgement, for that matter, for the LGBTQ community. And this is an official legal document that says there is a plan, and there will be a plan that legally protects these sites. And that's exactly what the IHPC does. And we are going to kind of complete the circle, if you will, by making sure that those plans have that history written into them, and that we are doing our part to make sure that we are referencing those plans and taking the significance of that history into consideration when making decisions about the future of these sites. And then I'm not sure how many more slides I have, but on the next slide is a little information about me if you ever wanted to get a hold of me. But where we're at with this project right now is there is a committee and a whole bunch of volunteers who are taking their time to help us finish the research and make sure we're validating the research, and that our staff will ultimately be including that language in the plans, which is going to take some time, and we are working through it. The Preserve Indy initiative was a 5-year initiative, so we're kind of halfway through it right now. But at the end, when the plans are complete, the history of those sites you'll be able to read that in those plans, and as well as future generations to come. And so that's just a real high level background of the project and our coordination efforts. And I have to say, I've been thrilled to be a part of this. And Jordan is so bright and such a professional in this field, and it has been a joy to work with. And I think we're making some really good progress and doing some really great work with this. And I'm very grateful for that.